background in interpretation and natural resources has made it so that I've been involved in a lot of different kinds of habitat projects and habitat restoration projects. But doing a project at a school is an entirely different kind of thing and comes with its own challenges. So I'm trying to compile what I've learned from the time when I was an environmental studies teacher at Green Intermediate School. And in this picture here, you can see one of the habitat projects my students and I worked on. I learned a lot in that process. I didn't always do things right, and I learned a lot from my mistakes. And I've also learned from different schools that I worked with when I was an interpreter that had outdoor labs. So this presentation is kind of a culmination of a lot of those different things that I've learned. I'm not entirely sure that the title of this presentation makes this clear, but for our purposes, when I say habitat projects in educational settings, that's gone by a lot of different names, an outdoor lab, butterfly garden, learning lab, whatever you want to call it. Basically, what I'm referring to is some kind of a habitat project at a school that its primary purpose is student engagement. And I shouldn't say habitat project at a school, just a habitat project where the primary objective is student engagement. And that doesn't necessarily have to be at a school. It can be at a community center, a community garden, a small park. So hopefully this has a little bit of relevance. If you're not a classroom teacher, this will hopefully have some relevance for you as well, if you're thinking of any kind of habitat project that has education as its main goal. Let's jump into this here. Hopefully technology will cooperate with us. My plan for how I want to present this today is we'll go through some of the early steps from planning to planting. And I recognize that depending on where you're coming at this from, you may have already gone through some of these steps. I haven't had a chance to look a lot at the participants' background as far as where you might be coming at it from. But whether you are further down the line and you've already established a habitat and you just want to be able to use it a little bit better, we'll have some tips for that. But I'm going to kind of organize this as sort of a step-by-step from the planning to the planting. And I think it can be, even if you're past some of these steps, it'll include some information that is good to revisit from these earlier steps. And you can always go back and use some of that information. And I think that will make itself clear as I go along what some of these steps I'm talking about. They came up on the screen here kind of quickly, but we'll go through them more slowly in a minute. And so if you're already through those steps, you'll also get something when we talk about how to engage your students with a schoolyard habitat. So I'll give you some curriculum suggestions. We'll talk a little bit about citizen science, and I'll share some additional resources with you as well. So all those things together will help us hopefully achieve these three key parts to successful schoolyard habitats, which are appropriate site selection, landscape design, and maintenance. So those are kind of all one category. I'm considering those all one category, basically just talking about the physical structure of the habitat, and then community and staff support, and then how you integrate it into the lessons. So if you're doing these things well, you have a better chance of having a schoolyard habitat that's useful and that lasts for a long time. And if you do any of these things not so well, any one of these things can kind of sink a project like this if they're not done well. So my goal is to give you some tools and tips that address all of these things. And these three things overlap quite a bit. They're not really separate. They're very much linked. So for example, if you don't design your landscape very well, you can lose community and staff support if it looks like something that people think is too weedy or too unkempt. So all these things are connected. We'll get to that a little bit more as we go as well. The benefits of a schoolyard habitat, I'm talking to an environmental education conference, so hopefully the benefits of this are fairly obvious to all of you, but just a couple notes about it. Anytime you're adding a little bit of habitat, even if it's just a small piece, that's good for the world, good for imperiled pollinators like monarch butterflies. And when you have those things, then it gives you something interesting for the students to observe and to interact with. these are a few pictures of my students and critters that we've found and things that we've done. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on talking about the benefits because you're environmental education folks, and I suspect that you understand that how a little habitat at a school could be helpful. I don't want to get into great detail about my background because some of that was already done in the introduction, but I do want to reference a couple of these things. I will reference a couple of these things as I go along, some experiences I've had in different jobs and how they can contribute to what I learned about the process. So when I make those references, I want you to know what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to give you a complete autobiography or anything. I started at Potato Creek State Park, which is up here in northern Indiana. I was an interpreter there. We also did a pretty fair amount of natural resource management and habitat restoration projects. I was not the lead person on that, but I was involved in it to some extent or another. Prairie restorations, prescribed burns, invasive species control, a number of other things like that. I worked for the St. Joseph County Parks. I also worked for the South Bend Parks Department at Rome Village Nature Center, where I was the assistant director for a number of years. And I left there to help a local school in the South Bend School Corporation called Green Intermediate School. I helped develop and teach their curriculum. The population, the enrollment was declining there at the school, and it had been considered for closure a number of different times, and the superintendent thought it would be a great place to try to attempt to create a environmentally focused middle school. So I was brought on board to develop that curriculum and to teach the program. So I did that for a number of years. It was a very rewarding experience, and I learned a lot from it. I was only there for 3 years, and shortly after I left, the program unfortunately did close down. It didn't get quite the boost in enrollment, and they had a change of administration and some other things. So unfortunately, that's not still going, but I did learn a lot from it, and learned some things. Maybe it could have been done a little differently to help it, but you'll benefit from any mistakes I made or lessons I learned from there. So, but I'll reference this school and things we did there quite a bit during this presentation. I now work at Cardno Native Plant Nursery. And so I was out of interpretation, environmental education, completely out of it for a short time, when I was collecting seed and doing a number of other projects associated with the propagation of native plants. But they did eventually give me some responsibilities associated with outreach and marketing. I'm the co-host of a local nature show on PBS called Outdoor Elements. And another project that I did that's kind of part of the outreach thing is helping to develop what we call the Monarch Prairie Kit. And we were getting a lot of calls from teachers that want to do some kind of habitat project at their school. And a lot of times with all the things that teachers have to do, that kind of project may seem overwhelming. Where do you start? What do you do? What plants do I need? All that kind of stuff. And we decided to try to simplify that process and create this kit, which comes with 100 plants and some tools. But the main part of it that I put a lot of time into was these little booklets that you see here called the Monarch Prairie Guide. And I kind of called back on all of my experience from being in interpretation and being an environmental educator, and put together what I think is a really good, concise book to help teachers get started on what can be an overwhelming process. And so we sell this kit. I'm not here in this presentation to sell you this kit, but I wanted to mention that because a lot of the resources that I'll share and a lot of what I've learned about this kind of came about when I was trying to summarize and collect all of what I had learned into a helpful format. And that's kind of, this presentation itself is sort of an evolution of some of the things I learned throughout creating that kit. Part of that kit is a web page that I created with some additional resources, and it's called the Monarch Prairie Guide. And if you go to Cardno Native Plant Nursery and look for a link to that, you won't find it, because we initially envisioned this as a resource that would be part of the kit. So when a teacher purchases the kit, they get access to this, but we wanted to share it with you for this conference today. Some of it does have a language that's sort of specific to the Monarch Prairie, but there are a number of other resources, documents down here at the bottom that hopefully you'll find useful. Things on funding your prairie, planning your prairie, how to prepare your site, and then some links to some other curriculum materials and to a few lessons that I created. I believe that I put this web address on my profile, so you should be able to access that if you check my profile after the presentation. So back to these, excuse me, successful schoolyard habitats have those things, and we'll just jump right in with some of the early steps. Now, again, I know some of you have already gone through these steps, but I think it's okay to revisit them and think about how you can go about addressing different aspects of this. The first few steps may seem a little bit obvious to the point of being unnecessary, but I thought they were worth including anyway. You want to identify a few site options. You might already have a site in mind that you are interested in, but I'd highly recommend, if you're early in this process, that you come up with as many potential sites at your school as you can. For a number of different reasons. Sometimes you might just have overlooked something maintenance related that prohibits you from being able to put the habitat where you want to. But it helps you when you go to discuss this with stakeholders. Probably the first person you'll want to approach when you have an idea about a project like this is whoever's in charge of maintenance at your school. And if you approach that person and you say, I'd like to put a prairie right here, that has a very different kind of feeling than, we're considering offering this resource to our students, but we want to make sure that it fits with your maintenance plan and that doesn't interfere with anything else that's going on in the school. So, can you help us identify the ideal location for this? When you approach things that way, you're going to get a lot more support. You don't want to alienate important stakeholders like the custodial staff right off the bat by telling them, hey, I'm going to put it here. So that's one of the reasons you want to have a couple of different options in mind for your site when you start this process. And so after you've discussed it with custodial staff and taking it to the principal and then later to other teachers, I would suggest starting with this discussion with the maintenance staff as opposed to anybody else. A lot of times you might think, well, I'm going to go talk to the principal about it. One of the main things your principal is going to want to know is, how does this fit with the maintenance issues? And so if you've already addressed that, it shows that you've done your homework and you're ready to go. The next step is to write a proposal. This is not something that I did when I was a teacher, and it is something that at certain times I definitely wish I had done. I'm calling it a proposal. You could call it a memorandum of understanding or a contract or whatever you want to do it, but it's some way of recording your expectations about this. And it's something that, especially if you've already talked to the principal and you already talked to the custodial staff and they're like, cool, yeah, we're on board with it. They may not know what they're on board with. So making sure that you have articulated your goals and expectations about it early in the process. It seems like a lot of work early in the process that might not feel necessary, but there could easily be times later on in which it becomes very necessary. So that proposal should include a number of different things: how it will benefit the students, obviously, how it will be used in the curriculum. That's a big one, and it might not seem real critical, but there are times when you can have different expectations about this than what other people in the school have. So just as an example, if you want to use it in an ecology unit and you want to talk to your students about invasive species and you have a plan to go out into the habitat and identify weeds and then pull those weeds, if that's part of your curriculum, but the maintenance staff is used to just pulling every dandelion they see on campus, or if the principal wants it to look tidier and they don't want weeds to persist at all, then they might get out there and pull the weeds that you were going to use as part of your unit on invasive species. So how it's going to be used, who's going to go into it, and for what purpose, those things are important to spell out in your proposal. You'll also want to put in that proposal what options you're considering for the site and what your criteria will be for making your final selection. principals, especially in administration, will want to know that you're thinking about safety. If you're walking across a parking lot, if you've got poison ivy, if you've got bees, and what's your plan for all that stuff? Your vision for how the school will share it. Is this mostly going to be something that science teachers in the school use? Is it going to be something that anybody can go in at any time? If not, who decides what the schedule is for using it? It's a good problem to have a whole bunch of teachers that want to use it, but you also have to have a plan for how you're going to share that, because you might have one teacher that wants to use it for reading time, just have the students out there reading quietly, and another teacher that wants to use it in some way that's a little noisier, and those two ways might conflict. So what is your vision of who will kind of make the call on how this is shared? I know this seems like a lot to do, and it might not always seem necessary, but there could definitely be issues if you don't do some of this stuff. And then your plan for maintaining it. Who's going to do the work of maintaining it? Native habitats, they can be relatively low maintenance compared to a lot of landscapes, but they're not maintenance free. Anyone who tells you they are, they're lying to you. No matter how you prepare it, weed seeds are going to blow in. I just got a call that came up on my computer, so I want to make sure that didn't affect my audio. Sometimes the audio shuts off for a second. So I'm going to pause for that to go away. Okay. So yeah, they are going to require a little bit of upkeep and maintenance. So who's going to do that? If you start with the assumption that the custodial staff is going to do it, that could be an assumption that gets you in some trouble. If you think you're just going to take the whole summer off and not go visit it and do any of the weeding on it, that isn't necessarily going to work. Also, if you tell the custodial staff, don't worry, I'm going to have my students work on maintaining it, that's not always something the custodial staff is going to have a lot of confidence in. Ultimately, if you are the one that's the driving force behind creating this, you should expect to be the driving force behind maintaining it. And any help you get is a bonus, but you'll want to spell that out in your proposal, what you want to bring to the table as far as maintenance. So you've done that, you've written your proposal, and you got people on board with it. So the next step is to do your final site assessment and make the selection about where it goes. Finding a place for your prairie is obviously very specific to your school and what you're trying to do. Every campus is a little bit different, but here are a couple of considerations that hopefully will be helpful, things that you can kind of keep in mind as you're starting this process, or as you're continuing to use a prairie you already have. There might be some things in here that are helpful. So how big is it going to be? If you got our Monarch Prairie kit that we have here, it includes 100 plants. If those are spaced 18 inches apart in a rectangle like this, with a little path in the middle, it's about 9 feet by 38 feet. I would say this is on the small end. Maybe it's close to the minimum size of little habitat you would want to have on your school. It'll be, you can get a lot out of a habitat that's this size, or you can go bigger. For me, in my mind, the bigger the better. The more chances you have to see more stuff, and the more habitat you're creating for pollinators. So I would always try to get as big as I can, as long as I know I can maintain it and it's not going to bother other functions at the school. This prairie in the picture, it's not, I think this picture is a little bit deceptive. It's a lot bigger than it looks to me in this picture. This strip of prairie is about 8 feet by 200 feet, and it included about 1,800, maybe close to 2,000 plants. The size of it is affected by a couple different things. What space you have available. I mean, that may be your ultimate limiting factor, but also the budget. Typically, when you're purchasing native plants, a lot of times they're around $2 or $3 per plant. And so you'd want to sort of think about that when you're budgeting for this. And you do want to aim for using plants in plugs instead of seed. If you're on a budget, seed may look like a very appealing option, and if it's your only option, go for it. But seed's going to take a little bit longer to get established. Your habitat's going to take a little bit longer to get going. And if you have the school on board and you have people's enthusiasm ready to go, you don't want that enthusiasm to have 2 or 3 years to fade out while you're waiting for these seeds to germinate and the plants to develop as fully as they would if you just started with plants in the first place. You can expand your prairie with seed. You can collect seed from the plants or buy more seed later on, but I would start with plants for sure. Also, what is your available labor when you're planning a thing like this as far as the size? We had students help out quite a bit with the planting of this. They did the vast majority of the planting. Are these younger students that are going to need a lot of guidance along the way? Or are they more mature students that can pick a little bit of direction and really run with it? One of the prairies that we did at Green School, I used kind of a combination of my full classes during the day, and then later on, sometimes we did some after school projects where a small select group of students, 5 or 6 students, did some planting. And most of the time, the 5 or 6 students got more done than a classroom full of 30, just because it's easy for me to get distracted by classroom management, and it's hard to delegate the responsibility of 30 kids at a time getting something done. So just depending on how you plan on planting this, that's also a factor in how big of a project you can take on. For these other considerations, the plant's needs, the convenience, the maintenance plan, one tool that I have available for you that's on that website, we have a lesson, and this is designed to be used with the students, but you can also use it yourself early in the process for selecting a site. The basics of this lesson are that you assign groups of students to assess 2 different possible sites, and they give those sites a point value based on these criteria. Does it have enough sunlight? What's the water availability? Site sharing, and then getting to the prairie. When I say site sharing, I'm referring to what else is going on the school grounds there. That big open field in the middle of this aerial photo, the soccer team uses that. Is the cross-country team, do they practice on the schoolyard in some way that's going to interfere? So how well does your plan fit with other things that are going on the site? And then how easy is it to get from the classrooms that are going to use it most to the site? Do they have to walk across a parking lot? Do they have to go around a fence? How easy is it to get there? So this activity is something that you can do with the students, but as I said, you can also do it with yourself early in the process, just to help you kind of zero in on your site. Going back to this one a little bit with water availability, once your prairie gets established, prairie plants are adapted to do pretty well even when conditions are fairly dry. But early in the process, when you're planting, it's very helpful to have water nearby. If you're planting in spring and summer when it starts to get hot, you'll probably have most of it done. If you're doing with students, you'll have most of it done before the summer, but it can still get pretty warm in the spring. And if you've put fresh little plants in the ground and you have a little bit of a drought, you can cost you whatever you invested in those plants. So having water nearby is important. I carried a lot of jugs of water because when we selected our site at the school, we didn't get a place where there was a hose that could reach there. So I did a lot of carrying of watering cans. So that kind of helps you deal with plants' needs and convenience as far as getting to the site. And then the maintenance plan, we've already discussed a little bit how important it is to get input from the maintenance staff. Just as an example of the kinds of things that you need to think about when it comes to working with the maintenance staff, back to this picture again, it's sort of an illusion here. It looks like this prairie is set right up against this fence, but it is not. There's actually a space back there. I wanted to make sure that if any repairs needed to be done to the fence, that they didn't have to tromp through the prairie. They might have to trim some branches above from those trees above the fence. And I wanted to make sure they had easy access to do that. And as soon as I created that space, that means there's a gap back there. And how big is that gap? It's not 70 inches, it is 72 inches at least. That's a very, I know I'm saying a very specific number, and that's for a very specific reason. If I had made that gap shorter than the deck of the mower, then that would have either caused a big headache for the guy who mows that area, or it would have caused our prairie to get mowed, a section of our prairie to get mowed down. So those are the things you want to have in mind when you are having these conversations with the maintenance staff, and showing them ahead of time before you even get things going that, hey, I was thinking of putting it here because I know it won't be as hard for you to mow around if I put it here. Those are the conversations that get people on board and help you get the support you're going to need to make this thing successful in the future. Another consideration is adjacent habitat. I don't know if I have a pointer on here available, but on the right side of this picture, that's where the prairie is, sort of up against the tree line. And just having that woodland there, and there's also a creek in those woods, that sort of expands what we can hope to expect as far as critters in our habitat. You have a little bit of cover right there. You have woods that maybe snakes and frogs and toads are in there, and they may slither over from that habitat into your habitat. If we had put that prairie out in the middle of this lawn, then a lot of animals aren't going to feel comfortable crossing that big expanse. Having an adjacent habitat is good. So even if it's not a habitat that your school owns, if you're on the border of something, that's something to consider. You'll get a little more wildlife appreciation, wildlife value out of your habitat if there's some nearby habitat. Noise considerations. This may seem fairly obvious, but if you're outside and you want to use this for just a nice place for the kids to read quietly, it'd be nice for it to be a peaceful, quiet space. If you have it next to the loading dock, or in this photo here, there are some trees on the left side, and we had a little bit of habitat there. And if you were assessing the habitat in the fall, you were walking around thinking about the noise, you might not immediately recognize that this thing up here in the corner, I don't have a pointer, but there's a heating and cooling system there. And in the warmer months, if you're trying to enjoy that habitat when there's a big heating and cooling system that is very noisy, it's noisiest when the air conditioner is running. You might not notice that in the fall, but it'll be a real hindrance to try to enjoy a peaceful time outside when that equipment's running. So those are some other things to think about in your site assessment. Let's discuss the overall shape of the prairie. And if there's one key thing that can really make a project like this succeed or fail, the design of it is really critical. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. We'll just start with the overall shape to begin with. We've got a rectangle here, and that's sort of how we did some of the habitats that we worked on at Green School. In this picture, by the way, they're kind of laid out on a grid, and that's just for simplicity, for graphics sake, so I could show this to you. But we really did put it on a fairly straight grid when we planted. And if that seems kind of visually unappealing to you, I wouldn't worry about that. It's nice to have a simple linear thing, and when it all grows, the plants grow at different rates and different fullness, and you can't tell at all 2 years down the line that it was planted on a straight linear grid. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I would say that a longer stretched out prairie is better than a big blocky one where it's harder to get access to the middle. Observing the things that are going on in the middle will be a little tricky. It's kind of nice to have, the kids the idea of what it's like to really be immersed in it, but there are some potential problems with having them stomp directly into it. And so in many cases, your long kind of prairie like this is going to work out better. And if it gives you more edge to spread around. And if you want to have the kids go out and kind of work on their own or investigate something and have some space between them, having it stretched out like this can be a little bit better. Even better is to have the prairie wrap around so that you can be in it. So you can have this sort of horseshoe shaped is kind of nice. You can have the students right in there. There's a whole different feeling. Even if it's a small prairie, it feels completely different to be at the edge of it looking in as opposed to it being surrounded by it like this. It gives you a much cooler feel of being out in nature to be wrapped around, have the prairie wrap around you like this. If you're going to do it this way, though, make sure your paths, you're still thinking about the lawnmower and what the maintenance folks might have to do. And you can put mulch down on the paths or some other things that you can do. But if you do this on a lawn where you expect mowing to be done, make sure that the gaps in this are wide enough that a mower can get through them. Here's a simpler, this is what we intended to do at Green, is just have 2 long strips of prairie. And then just having those like that, it's like you're walking down a prairie trail and gives you the feeling of being in the prairie. I would not recommend putting habitat against a wall, although I know in a lot of cases it's unavoidable. Sometimes if people are trying to do a native planting at a school, they just replace the existing landscaping. And so sometimes it's unavoidable and it's okay to do that. But if you have a choice, I would not do it. First of all, it takes away that side as far as accessing it and having the kids spread out along that side to look for it. And it also, if there's maintenance that needs to be done on the building or access to the roof or anything like that, your plants can get stomped on, and that can cause some issues there. So I would suggest moving it away from a building when you can. Oops. So after you've picked out your site and you've kind of thought about the shape of it a little bit, it's time to start thinking about sourcing the plants and where you're going to get your plants and materials, and how you're going to lay the whole thing out. The number of plants you need will depend on some other measurements. This is a really good place to get the students involved in measuring. If your students are working on geometry, this is a great activity for them to be involved in early in the process. If you decide to do it yourself and not necessarily make that part of what they're doing, there's some helpful tools. Omnicalculator.com has a whole bunch of different kinds of calculator functions, including this plant spacing calculator, where you can put in the length and width of an area and your plant spacing, and it will tell you how many plants you need. Another part of that, another thing you can consider in this stage, is marking the boundaries. I found it very helpful to be able to see the size and the perimeter of it. So I asked our custodial staff to use the tools that they use for marking the soccer field. They mark the perimeter of our prairie when we were just getting started. I found that really helpful just to visualize what was going where. That's another thing to consider. So how do you design as far as the actual plants you put in the ground? This picture you see here is what not to do. And I wrote an article about what not to do based on this area you see here, which happens to be my backyard at my old house. I made a lot of mistakes in designing my own backyard prairie. I learned a lot from that. And I believe on my profile, there should also be a link to an article that I wrote, this article that I'm referring to, about what I learned from doing this wrong in my own backyard and how and why I'm using a different strategy now. I was trying to avoid having a backyard that looked like this. I know this is a popular kind of landscape, but it happens to be, for me, this is like nails on a chalkboard. I just don't like this kind of landscape. It's not natural. It's not great habitat. And when you use this kind of very formal looking landscape aesthetic, it requires a lot of long-term maintenance because you have these plants in an island of mulch, and you have to constantly maintain that mulch, constantly weed that mulch, and it's not appealing. And my background, when I was helping restore big 10, 20, 30, 40 acres at a time at Potato Creek, was to use a lot of seed, and it got very tall. That works okay in a park, but in your own backyard, when it looks like this, that can be overwhelming. And a landscape that looks like this is, you can lose support for your project if it starts to look like that. So I was fortunate enough to attend a conference with a keynote speaker named Thomas Rayner, who co-authored a book called Planting in a Post-Wild World. And actually the following year, his co-author Claudia West was the keynote speaker. And this is just in the last couple of years that I've really been exposed to this, and it's really changed the way I approach native landscapes. And it's especially important if you're doing a native landscape, not a big habitat restoration in a park, but in a place where a lot of people are going to see it, and a place where stakeholders have something to say about the way it looks. When I talk to a lot of homeowners that are interested in doing native landscapes, where they have a homeowners association or other nosy neighbors that are going to be very judgmental if it looks too messy and not taken care of well. That article that I mentioned, it gets into greater detail about this than I'm going to get today, but some of the key points to this are that in my landscape here, I use plants that are what we would call the design layer plants. And if you talk to most people with a moderate level of knowledge about native plants, purple coneflower, monarda, black-eyed Susan, those are the kinds of things that people tend to be most familiar with. So that's what they put in their native landscape. But those are all design layer plants. And if you dominate your landscape with those, it's going to be too messy. What most landscapes are missing when they get out of control like that is an effective layer of ground cover. The title of this keynote presentation from Thomas Rayner was that plants are the best mulch. And you don't need mulch if you know how to use ground cover effectively. So at least 50% of the landscape, ideally, would be ground cover. And that might seem like it's not that much. And a lot of times the ground cover isn't as colorful and may not seem as attractive to pollinators, but it's essential to make your habitat inviting and appealing. And it does actually provide a lot of habitat to have that ground cover. In fact, it can be an essential part. And what Thomas Rayner and Claudia West do in this book is they talk about how this actually mimics natural systems much better than many of the native landscapes that people try to create with just design element plants. So this is Sporobolus, for example, and this is a really good ground cover plant. And it's one of the plants, in that article, I finished the article with a list of species that are ground cover species, that are design layer, and that are structural layer, and fit with that approach that those landscape architects who wrote that book that they use. And this is one of the very popular plants to use as ground cover in a habitat like this. This is our rows of Sporobolus at the nursery. And although it's just one species here with another, I think, sunflower species in the background, if you compare the way this looks and feels with the way that picture of my backyard looks, I find this a lot more aesthetically pleasing. You wouldn't want to keep it just one species, but as opposed to having a whole bunch of things that are really tall and it's all overwhelming, to have those colorful species spread out among a sea of this is a much better strategy. It takes a lot to really give you the complete picture of this kind of strategy, and I think I did a fairly decent job in this other article, so I'll leave you with that and highly recommend that you look at that book by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. We have plant kits available at the nursery that have a good selection of native species. Some of those plant kits do have the Sporobolus in there. Hopefully for an environmental education conference, I don't have to go into a lot of detail about why native plants are better. I'm not just saying that because I work at a native plant nursery. I was into native plants when I was an interpreter in environmental education. They attract more native insects, which attract more birds, and it really makes it's more ecologically productive to have native plants. You can't just go to any garden store and buy those, so you may have to do some research. Obviously, we'd love it if you get them from Cardno, but there are a handful of other places around where you can get native plants, but you can't really expect just to walk to your local garden store and get what you need that's really going to be productive in your habitat. Whether you get plants from us or not, we have a lot of resources available. If you get online, Cardno Native Plant Nursery, check out our website. We have our catalog. Our catalog is one of the best all-around ways to get information about native plants, how to prepare sites, how to maintain the sites, a lot of specific information about each plant. In fact, before I worked at Cardno, when I was a teacher, I used that catalog. I printed copies of a lot of pages off, and my students used that catalog and the information about specific plants to help design the prairie, because they wanted to know, what plants are tall, what plants are going to bloom when. And so we use this catalog. It has a lot of good information in that catalog. There's a digital copy available. We have paper copies available too, but the digital copy is available online. So you've sourced the plants and materials, and then it's time to begin prepping the site. This is going to be different for everybody too. Of course, if you're removing traditional landscaping, you might be digging up rhododendrons or whatever, and then using land there, or you might be doing it over turf, which is what we did. There are a couple different options available. I'm not anti herbicide, but at a school you might have to take that out of your palette of possibilities just because it may be something that some people are averse to. So smothering is an option with like black plastic or landscape fabric covered with mulch. And this is something you could do, this time of year, start that process. And then as things start to green up in the springtime, when you remove that, there should be some soil to work with there. There are some other options for vegetation removal and site preparation. And I didn't want to get into great detail about that now. We have those resources available online. But that's one way to do it. Planting depth, maybe some of you have planted before. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about that. A few tips on the planting process, especially if you're involving the students in that process. Depending on the age level, maybe they can measure and space out things well. The design element is so critical though, you can't afford to make a lot of mistakes if you're getting the students involved. So I would not involve the students in this process unless you're very sure that they can make the design and the long-term product nice looking, like we talked about previously. So you can, if you do want to get the students involved in some way without necessarily having them measure things out, you can measure it out and put little popsicle sticks, sometimes labeled with the plants if you want to get that specific in your planning of what plants go where. And then they can just move through, pull out the popsicle stick, and then plant the plant that is associated with that. Skip that for a second. One quick tip that was something I eventually learned while we were planting. I had a critter container, just a couple of empty critter containers that we had on hand. Depending on how much you're in a time crunch and how much you're trying to get this done quickly, if you're trying to kind of keep the kids on task a little bit, having a critter container there is very helpful, because we found a lot of things. We dug up worms and grubs and different cool things that the kids were fascinated with. And as a bug nerd and environmental educator, I don't want to deter kids from being distracted by things like bugs. But if you're in a time crunch, it can be important to have that critter container. And I would use it and say, I'd grab a little critter or spider or something that we would find, put it in that critter container, and then say, hey, that's cool. We're going to take this back to the classroom and investigate it later. But for now, we're going to keep planting. So that's a little tip that you may find helpful. Another tip is have the kids work backwards, keeping the plants in front of them. No matter who you are, I would say that this is something that kids do, but I think adults do this sometimes too when you're doing a big planting. It's easy to kind of lose track of what you've done and step on something you just planted. So if you're getting the kids involved in this planting process, have them always keep plants in front of them. There should not be plants behind them, and they'll work backwards away from the plants that they've planted. That prevents them stepping on plants a little bit. Depending on how you go about doing it, you might do this with groups of students. I would recommend that the student groups have a lot to do per person, as opposed to having a group that's too big where they don't have enough to do. If you're planting a big project and the kids don't have enough to do, and then you have a classroom management issue. So having smaller groups is more likely to keep the kids engaged. So for example, in a group of 4 students, having 2 students digging and then 2 students coming behind them and planting and watering is a pretty good strategy to have if you're trying to involve your class in this. And then having the plugs removed in advance is another good idea. You could be doing that while the students are working, or you could have a student just assigned to doing that well in advance. Sometimes removing the plugs from these trays can be tricky. You don't want to have 4 or 5 kids waiting around on one kid who's removing all the plugs. So having that done in advance is a helpful thing. Skip that. So in my original iterations of this PowerPoint presentation, I didn't focus as much on the written proposal part of it, and we have discussed that in some detail. But this section is sort of a remnant of the previous iterations I have of this PowerPoint presentation. But I wanted to include it because there are some notes in here, some questions that you would want to address in that written proposal for your different stakeholders, your maintenance staff, administration, educators, all these people you see listed here. So I'll go through this and just bring up some of the key points that you'll want to make sure you include. Your administrative staff, do they support your project? You may think right off the bat, yes, they support it. One thing you want to consider is, what about the next administration? What about when this principal moves on? Do you have something ready to go to share with this next person that explains what it's all about, that shares your successes with this? So if you already have everybody on board and you think, I'm not going to do this written proposal because everyone loves it and it's fine. Another thing that written proposal does is it gives you a document just ready to hand on to the next person that explains the importance of what you're doing. Another thing to supplement that proposal with is a portfolio of photos of lessons that were successful. As you're using this habitat, make sure you document what you're doing. Take pictures, show the kids using and enjoying it, because that will help you maintain support in the future. Your proposal also makes it clear what it is the administration is supporting. They may say they support it, but there are different ways that you might envision this thing working. So make sure they understand what they're supporting when they say they support it. Same with other educators in the school. They should know what they're supporting. You might have other teachers that have interests and talent to lend, and writing out your proposal helps make your vision clear of how it's going to be used. You also want to communicate to them that it's not going to be a distraction. On some school campuses, you might have the only place where you can use it is right outside of another classroom, and you don't want it to be a big distraction. So doing things to ease any concerns about that is important. Making sure your vision matches is something that I've highlighted here, because that's another thing that can just get you off course. And I think I cover this a little bit in the written proposal with potential conflicting ideas about how it's going to be used, but that's something to make sure you include. Your maintenance staff, we've touched on this already. They may also have some interest in talent to lend. Maybe they're real into native plants. Maybe they are super happy to help you with this. It's important, these next 2 things on this list, understanding the distinction between the support you might have at the school, and sometimes, depending on the size of your school corporation, they might have supervisors in a downtown building that are less supportive of it. So make sure you're aware that just because the custodian that you've talked to is on board with it, make sure everyone, if they say, yeah, I'm really willing to help, you may need to make sure you're securing support from everyone involved in that. And I'll also, just as a side note, I had an issue with our prairie at the school. Our custodian was completely on board. I always work with very helpful people. And in the summertime, he wasn't doing as much of the maintenance. They brought people from downtown with bigger tractors, and they never got the word that we were planting a prairie. So one year our prairie got mowed down at a time we weren't expecting it to. It probably didn't, it ended up being fine. Sometimes mowing early in the process is helpful, but it certainly wasn't something we were expecting. So understanding that might be other people involved with the maintenance that you need to communicate with is important. So including them in the process, as I've mentioned earlier, is important. Don't make any promises that it will reduce the amount that they have to mow or maintain. If you're using up a big chunk of lawn, of turf, and you think, well, I'm reducing the amount they have to mow, that might be the case. Or it might, if you don't plan it well, they might have to work around that in a different kind of way. It might create some other issues for them. So don't necessarily make that promise that they're not going to have to mow as much. I've seen situations where that promise has been made and not kept, and it causes some conflict. And the design aspect that we discussed earlier is really critical. So make sure you commit to an aesthetically pleasing design, because if it starts to look shabby and people start to complain about it, they may be the ones that get that complaints before you do. And you want to try to ease any concern about that. Your students, what's their involvement going to be in planning? Have that in mind before you get started. What curriculum you're going to use to inspire learning. I will share some options with you in a minute, and how they're going to take responsibility for its care. You might end up getting sponsors that help you with the funding for this. How do they expect to be involved in the project? And how are you going to, is there an event that you can create that publicizes their contributions to it? That's a good way to keep sponsors on board, is to make these kinds of events, drawing some attention to the help that they offered, and how you'll keep them involved is important. On the website, the Monarch Prairie website, we created a couple of resources for you. There's sort of a generic certificate of appreciation that you can download a PDF and customize that with the name of a community partner that's helped you fund your prairie. So that's available to you. There's also sort of a generic outreach letter seeking some sponsorship and support there that you can also customize. And that's part of funding your prairie, and there's some other options on that website, our Monarch Prairie website, ideas for funding your prairie. So how do you engage the students with a habitat? I've got some curriculum suggestions here. First of all, this is a lesson that I created, and it's on that website. I like this one. I think there are similar lessons out there. Hopefully I didn't steal too much of this. If I did, I don't know where I stole it from, but you know how it goes. Environmental education ideas get passed around quite a bit. But the basics of this lesson are that each student observes a particular plant over the course of 2 or 3 lessons, and they observe it quantitatively, qualitatively, and then aesthetically. And they describe it in those terms. And it's really just a good way of starting to amp up their observational skills and get them used to being in the prairie and looking closely at plants. I like this activity a lot, and that's available on the website. Originally, when I started putting together this Monarch Prairie kit, I thought I was going to be making a lot more lessons, but the more I researched it, the more I realized there are too many really good activities already out there, too many good curricula already out there, so I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I would say probably the single best thing that I've seen is from the Monarch joint venture. I believe I posted a link to there on my profile, and to some of the resources that they have. They're closely associated with the University of Minnesota Monarch Lab. In fact, I think there was a switch over where the Monarch Lab and Monarch joint venture really combined. They have a lot of really good resources and educational materials. Some of the best curricula I've seen come from Monarch joint venture. So if you don't know where to start with how to use this, that's my number 1 recommendation is going there. The Earth Partnership for Schools is also really a good one. NAAE obviously has a lot of really good resources. I'm the state coordinator for the Leopold Education Project, which is an outdoor education curriculum based on a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. So they have some good resources as well. Citizen science is a great way to get your students engaged in the prairie. And this document here that has some links to some of the best citizen science websites is available on our Monarch Prairie page. Budburst is a really good one to use. Journey North, Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, those are associated with monarch butterflies. But Journey North has expanded. They have some other things now too, hummingbirds and American robins and other citizen science projects where the kids are collecting data and contributing it to real research. And you can find a really good database of all of these at a website called SciStarter. So there's a ton of cool citizen science projects, and you can search by age group or topic and theme, all these different things. So I highly recommend that one. I'm going to skip through a little faster here because I'm running short on time. I appreciate those of you who are still with us. This Monarch Prairie Guide, again, this is another resource you can call on to use. It's got a lot of information on the planning that I've discussed already in this presentation. One last thing that I'll say about making the most of your prairie, if you're not already an insect expert, become one, because you're not going to draw bald eagles and bobcats to your school by having a prairie, but you will probably draw lots and lots of really cool insects. And the more you know about them, they can really become the basis for a lot of cool ecology study. I really like insects a lot. That's one of my favorite things. It always has been as a naturalist, environmental educator. I highly recommend the book Kaufman's Field Guide to Insects. If you're not an insect expert yet, that's the book to get you started. When it comes to bird books, there's a lot of debate about the best field guides, but as far as I'm concerned, the Kaufman Field Guide to Insects stands heads above all the other ones. So those are some suggestions about using it. I've kind of taken up most of my time. I am ready for questions. Also, one more quick thing. I maintain our social media, and I post a lot of articles that might be useful on our Cardno Native Plant Nursery Facebook page. So questions, anything I can answer for you?
Thank you, Vince. I think that you are able to, everybody's able to unmute themselves if they have any questions, so feel free.
Paul McAfee here. I have a question for you.
Sure.
You ever do woodland plantings? And if so, do you have the same things you need to consider, or?
Yes, I did intend to mention that and I kind of forgot. Most of the time these are done with prairie plants that need more sunlight, but there are, Cardno Native Plant Nursery does carry woodland species and things that do well in the shade. A lot of times those are a little trickier to come by, and sometimes they're more expensive. They're a little harder to propagate. But you can definitely do that. And we definitely have some species available for that. And I think among our plant kits that we offer, we do have one that is a shade kit. And I referenced that article that I wrote about the design, and that article is called Native Landscaping with all the Benefits and None of the Headaches. And at the end of there is a plant list, and the plant list is organized by those 3 categories, ground cover, design layer, and structure. But they also, I made sure to include some that do better in moist soils, some that do better in dry soils, some that do better in the sun, and some do better in the shade. So you will find, if you've tracked down that article, a list of species that serve all those functions in a shaded habitat.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? A quick note for anybody still on board here. My name is spelled wrong, I think, in the profile. So if you're trying to look me up and get more information, it's Gresham, Gresham. And I'm really happy to help with any project that you are trying to get involved in for school. Tried to cram a lot into this presentation, but there are other areas, other ways I think I can be helpful if you need. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to consult on other questions you have.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. That so many little details that, oh, there we go. So many little details that people don't think about when they're starting things out. So that was really, really helpful. Thank you very much, Vince. Well, I think that's the end of this one. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Be sure to continue the discussions in the Whova dashboard. And thanks for joining today. We've got lots of things going on this afternoon. So if you are a new member, we've got our new member session at 5:30. And then we've got our keynote speaker and our awards tonight. And then we've also got the talent contest. So make sure you check in a lot this evening and afternoon for some more fun stuff. So thanks, Vince.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting.
A really nice job. Very thorough.